Hi, everyone. This is Chaudhary, Psychotherapist, and today we have a special episode called Shame Shifting and Sibling Estrangement. What can we do? And of course, I'm here with Fern Schumer Chapman. Thanks for being here, Fern.
Oh, it's always fun to talk to you about sibling estrangement and all of the ramifications of those experiences.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is a really important episode because I remember that our last episode, we dove into the 7 rules of shame-based families and their siblings. And it was a powerful episode also because it was jam-packed with what shame shifting can look like and feel like in the context of our sibling relationships. And what we'd like to do is maybe to discuss more with regards to what we can practically do when some of these situations manifest and such. So I know that we can discuss a little bit more about some of these types of empowering thoughts to live by and such. So we'll get into that. I think that that's especially important, but I do want to say though that, and maybe this is your experience, but we were talking a little bit before the video and we're talking about the tendency to revert back to our earlier selves.
Yes. I think when you're around your sibling, you simply assume those old childish roles, and it's so important to stay in your adult self. And it actually reminds me of a funny joke, which was that for every day that you're with your family or visiting your family, you regress 5 years. So keep your visits short enough so that you'll be able to drive away legally.
I like that. That's good. That's good. Remember that.
I mean, I actually think there's a mindfulness to this, and it requires constantly saying to yourself, I'm an adult, I'm not 15 anymore, and he's not my big 17-year-old brother, and I need to stay with my adult thinking and take responsibility for who I am and what I do as an adult rather than as a 15-year-old.
You know, I think that's really, really important what you're saying there, because I think that that's going to be the overall theme for us today. It's going to be to reclaim our identity following these experiences that we have, you know, growing up or otherwise, sometimes in adult life, of course, you know. So, let's get into the first one. I think that this is especially important, you know. And one of the points that we came up with is to look at who I am despite what my sibling thinks of me, and that we're more powerful as adults than we think. And I think it's important to remember that we define ourselves on our own terms and not so much on what our sibling thinks of us. It's important that we be very clear about who we are, and how they see us is not a reflection of reality, nor of the depth of who we truly are as individuals. So I think it's important if our viewers, for our viewers to know that they can highlight qualities that represent them now, and you know, were some of those qualities prevented from shining out when you were growing up in the past with your sibling. That's something to look at.
You know, the interesting thing too about what we are talking about is it's one thing for you to maintain your adult self, but you have to assume that your sibling, who might be somewhat toxic, is absolutely reverting to their child self. So you can only control your own presentation of yourself. You can't control what they do.
Exactly. And that's the freedom that we have. That's like one of the biggest lessons we need to internalize for ourselves, is that we get to choose what we do with us, you know. And a good way to do that also on a practical level is to ask ourselves, like, what does our ideal self look like? I think that that's a great question just to explore. You know, how would the fully accomplished, idealized you look like? And to see how we can take a few steps towards that. What would be like one action step, or maybe 2, that would get you closer to that? Mm-hmm.
Well, I think and you have to assume, like I said, that the forces acting upon you are going to be to put you back in that child position. So You know, you have to almost go into this thing knowing that you're going to have this tendency to lapse back.
Yeah, I think that's the thing too, to be able to recognize that the notion of kind of regressing in that way is especially important. So something to help us to kind of avoid going into regression is to sometimes refuse to engage with them. So backing away from toxic behavior by something that saps your energy and has a hold on you. I think that just being able to remember that interactions require two people or more. And to refuse to allow for certain situations to play themselves out is to not create the opportunity for it to happen. So when siblings have no outlets to fight with you, then what ends up happening is basically their words basically just end up blowing in the wind, you know? So that's the thing that's important to remember, is to be wise and to choose the moments you participate in very carefully. And that can sometimes mean ignoring or blocking text messages, turning down a meeting, just learning to say no to what might look like an innocent get-together.
So I think what you're saying really is, as an adult, you have self-agency. You have to act on your own behalf, almost like a protective parent. And that's the key to this, is to taking responsibility for yourself and making sure you're protected and not hurt.
Yes, and we've talked about this in some of the forums that we participate in about bringing in the protector. What would protector do in that case? And that's another great question to ask, and to make sure that you, of course, avoid the metamorphosis of a circus, if you will, that can happen in situations like this. So it's always important to remember that you have the freedom to choose what you do with yourself, and that's key. So another thing that we can look at, of course, is are you living by another person's or society's standard, and why not yours? And I think this is something that we learn over time, and we've talked about this, the notion of people pleasing. I think that this is something I'm going to write more about on my blog also, because I think this is so important. The importance in recognizing that we give up a part of who we are just for a few moments of respite. So what ends up happening in cases like that is you're actually going towards more of an unhealthy expression of people pleasing, because there are healthy expressions of that, right? You want to be pleasant in certain conversations and such. Okay, sure. But it's when it becomes chronic, when it becomes something that you're basically just squashing your own needs, suppressing your own needs and wants and such. I think that that's important, that we recognize that there may be too much of a good thing.
I think it's important to recognize when to walk away, when to detach, and when to actually say something. And that's a really tricky balance. So if you choose to say something, you want to frame it in a way that they hear you, and you're not just triggering all of their defenses. So you want to make those I statements, which of course everybody talks about I statements. When you do that, I feel hurt.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can verbalize it, you can voice it, and that's fine. It can be part of the work involved in that. Keeping in mind, of course, that sometimes siblings can be bullies, and that they might, of course, invariably use that sometimes against us. Nevertheless, the greater good is, of course, to find your voice, speak out, of course, make your needs known. And that can be part of the work, part of the goal that you give yourself, perhaps in interactions, towards becoming that ideal self that we want to be.
Well, and also, and we've discussed this previously as well, sometimes you just have to say to yourself that this person is so toxic that I'm going to need to figure out exactly the parameters of what I can engage in with him or her. So that means that I'm not going to talk about certain subjects. I'm going to leave when I get stressed or uncomfortable. All of these things are ways to sustain some relationship and not expect that it's going to be any more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of leads us into the next point too, which is basically being clear about what behaviors you stand for, those you won't tolerate. If we're not careful, we can fall into habituation, which basically makes us normalize unhealthy behaviors, and that's the thing that happens to us when we're growing up is families are first exposure to various behaviors, right? And whether they're unhealthy or healthy, we won't really know until we're exposed to something else. So if we're exposed long enough to it, we can basically conclude that, well, that's just the way it is. And if our parents normalize it, then of course, then we can tend to normalize it too. Well, that's another issue, of course, that can happen. But it's important that we get back in touch with what we think, feel, and desire. And we did touch upon this last time too. It's really important that we do that because what we expect out of a healthy behavior is healthy sibling behavior is especially important. So a good way to do that is to ask other people, how was it for them when they were growing up with their own siblings? And chances are you're probably going to run into some people that have had healthy, positive experiences with their sibling. And then you can kind of use that as an example of, oh, okay, well, I can see that that's a healthy relationship, and you can choose to include that in your own personal guidelines also. Okay, that person's doing that. I'd love to have that. And that might be something of the ideal that I'd like to experience. So that can help you to see how far you may be drifting away whenever you're experiencing something different with your own sibling and what you want to get closer towards.
Well, and Ali John, you and I have discussed this idea that in a upcoming episode, we are going to actually help viewers understand what is a healthy relationship. Because when you're raised in this, it's very hard to figure out what to expect and what is a better place to have a family connection.
Absolutely. I think that that's important that we delve deeper into that, and we'll perhaps, of course, do that at a later time. I think that our viewers would like that. And I think that, again, I think it's important because I'm just mindful of the time here, and I know that our time is almost up. But what I want to look at also is just the notion of giving importance to your thoughts and perceptions. I think that writing them down if we need to, and understanding that we have the right to think and feel the way we do, I think that that's especially important in building our own identity with regards to that. Granting importance to our thoughts, making them primary rather than secondary, and to just kind of honor them, cherish them, nourish them, I think is especially important.
And not be influenced by the last person who talked to you.
That's right, exactly. We have to be careful with that and not regress, right?
Not regress. And actually, I know one of them that you wanted to talk about too is humor. And I am such a big believer that if you can break through the stress of relationships with humor, and of course there's a lot of humor in sibling relationships because they go back such a long way. And there are lots of shared experiences that you could probably find joy in. So it's a great fertile ground for humor.
I agree. I think it's really, really important to be able to kind of look at that as a healthy expression, of course, and be mindful of the unhealthy expressions and to use humor, I think, in that way to kind of keep things light too, because it is a good way to keep things light. In extreme circumstances, we can avoid brainwashing by using humor. So that means that you can redefine yourself differently by using humor in some ways. So I think that that can really highlight the ridiculousness of certain situations we've all been through with our siblings. But, again, we can very much, of course, identify with some of the positive, healthy expressions that may have occurred also. So it's about navigating through the realities we really want to keep and what we don't. And maybe one more thing before we go, Fern, I just want to mention very quickly, it's important for people to ask themselves if their inner critic has become too strong or if it has the place that they feel it should have. Because oftentimes we're our own worst enemy. And if we're not careful, we can be our own worst critic. And I think it's important that we recognize that we may have internalized a dialogue of something our sibling may have said to us. And to hear that voice in our sibling's voice is a good way to find out if that's the case or not.
Yes, I hear my brother's voice, his sarcastic adolescent voice often. And I have to stop it in my brain and say, oh no, that was a long time ago and I'm not buying in anymore.
Yes, I remember my own sister's sarcastic voice too when it came to certain things too. So I recall that, and I can of course kind of put it in perspective, and and it might be something that our viewers can learn to try to do over time. So so let's be conscious of that. Let's be conscious of these different opportunities that we have to better ourselves and get closer to our ideal self. I think that's especially important in everything we've been talking about today.
And I just want to conclude with one thought, and that is that if you're hearing that 15-year-old sarcastic brother or sister that you have to recognize as an adult that if you're internalizing that, you're internalizing a 15-year-old or 17-year-old or whatever that brother or sister was at the time that they said that to you. So that brings you right back to a very young age. You don't want to be there.
Exactly. So recognizing that, recognizing you're an adult, recognizing this happened a long time ago, and recognizing that you can make choices now and like with where you're going and who you want to be. So I think that's really important. I think that we've done a good job today at talking about what we can do with shame shifting and such.
So now all of our viewers can visit with their family and drive away legally.
Yes, we can say that.
It's always great to be with you, Ollie John.
Likewise, Fern. Thank you for doing this again, and we'll again connect on another team in the near future. Thank you again.